We're back. I want to welcome you guys back to the Transition Game podcast brought to you by Athlete to Boardroom. I'm Rodney Williams, the founder of Athlete to Boardroom, which is a consulting company that helps retired athletes transition after sport. Wow, it's been quite some time. We were doing this before. And you know what this platform is about. It's about real stories, connecting with athletes to learn more about what they're doing nowadays, how their transition went, to give people insight into industries that you may not even know about. And so, we want to be a company, we want to be a brand that allows people to share their stories, and hopefully athletes who are currently playing that are getting ready to transition, or those that have already transitioned, can get some inspiration from the things that we're able to uncover. I want to thank you guys for sticking with me. There's been a lot of transition in my life, and so I had to put this down for a bit, but I'm ready to get back in the saddle and talk about real things. As we know, the world is moving pretty fast nowadays, and it's harder and harder for folks to transition after sport. But once that moment comes, how can we as athletes uplift each other to prepare one another to be able to make that transition as smooth as possible? And so tonight's episode is just going to be a little bit different. It's going to be more about a reintroduction of myself, my journey as an athlete, how I got into what I'm doing now, and some of the entrepreneurial things. But then also just, putting a face and a name to that transition, right? That everybody has to go through at some point. And so, this is more of a welcome back episode, but you guys can expect many things to come soon. Stay tuned and let's get into it. And so I'm just going to walk you down my story about how I became the athlete that I was, how I got into college, professional ranks, and then now working in different fields. And so, yeah, man, it all started a kid from Richmond, Virginia, that, didn't play basketball at first, was always tall and lanky, but, wanted to make some strides in my game. And so I started playing basketball in the ninth grade. When you really think about that, that's very late. And I got into playing AAU basketball, 14, 15 years old, tried out for my high school team, made it because I was tall, but I wasn't very good. And then from that standpoint, I had the basketball bug, man. I played 2 years of JV. I realized that reclassifying was going to be a great option for me because I just needed a little bit more time, being that I was such a late bloomer. But was able to reclassify into class of 2013, went to prep school, did well there. The rest was history. Ended up with 30 scholarship offers from top Division I institutions. I'm a Philly guy at heart. I love the Philadelphia Eagles. I ended up visiting, I would say, 4 or 5 Philadelphia schools. It came down to Drexel, St. Joe's, LaSalle, throw Penn in there, and then also looked at Temple. And so I had my heart set on going to Philadelphia. I didn't know why, but I knew that I wanted to be in the city and be able to be a part of that basketball culture. Ended up, going on my visit and enjoyed myself at Drexel. Coach Bruiser Flint, rolled out the red carpet. There was the steaks, there was this, there was that. And the energy around the team was so good. And so ended up going with Drexel, had a pretty good career there. And then from that standpoint, started looking at my options. Was it going to be, I had a chance to possibly try out for a team? Was there going to be a chance that I would be able to get a job right out? I just didn't know. I knew that I was talented, but it was one of those transition moments where I didn't necessarily know what was going to be next. So, my MO is just try new things. And so what I actually did was, after that last senior season in that springtime, I decided to get an internship. I was always interested in entrepreneurship, in like business development, creating new businesses, like things like that. I grew up in a family of entrepreneurs. My father and himself, he is a pastor, an Army veteran, and serial entrepreneur. He had a laser tag. He sold ties in the mall. He had an old time photo shop. He even changed people's oil. And so I grew up seeing somebody work for themselves, and that to me seemed very appealing. And so I was able to land a internship doing like business development for a biomedical company, and got my feet wet working. But what it made me realize is that, while I still had the chance to go play and the chance to do those things, I wanted to take that opportunity. I wasn't quite ready to give basketball up. Blessed and fortunate enough to get a overseas contract. So I played in Israel, played in Spain, played in Sweden, all those things brought on a new transition, but still within the sport. And so, I was excited about that. I remember getting off the plane and being in a foreign country for the first time by myself and having a lot of fear around that transition. And some of the things that I did was try to connect myself to people who have gone through this and have been through this. And luckily, Drexel had a lot of different players that were playing in different countries overseas. And actually, the first team that I was able to join, it had a Drexel alum on it. And so that definitely eased my transition. But there was a huge learning point that I had to cross, and that was learning how to be a professional. I think we talk about, being a pro. We talk about doing these things when you're out of sports, but nobody talks about it while you're in it. And I struggled a lot when I first got to playing in Israel and playing overseas. I didn't understand that this was a job now and that there's other grown men on the other side of the court that are playing for families. And here's this guy fresh out of college that, thought he was the guy. Right. And then I realized quickly that when you're playing for money and you're playing for livelihoods and you're playing for that next contract, things got to elevate. It took me a while to get that. And I went through a transition point where that team didn't work out. At that point, I was questioning my talents. I was questioning everything that I've done, leading up to that point, getting to college, being the guy, being player of the year, being all these things. And here I am sitting in a foreign country at a coffee shop, just got fired. It was a humbling moment, but it was something that I needed to realize that there's another level of professionalism that you have to get to. And not a lot of people talk about that, right? They talk about the glitz and glamour, but they don't talk about the parts where you really do have to grow as a player, grow as a professional, grow as an adult. And I had to learn that fast, but luckily, I was able to get to another team that same year without having to go home. And because I was able to do that, that preserved my career for the next 2 to 3 years. So then I went to Spain, went to Spain with some fresh perspective, of course, after being fired, man. But, got in that team, did what I needed to do, took care of my business, didn't, do anything that was outside of being productive and making sure that I can keep that job. And, from that standpoint on, the next country was France, played well there. And then the next country was Sweden, played well there. And then there was another point of transition, and we can talk about it because the entire world went through this with the pandemic. The world stopped. I was in the middle of my season. I remember the first couple cases of COVID had started happening, and the NBA stopped. And once the NBA stopped, all the European basketball seemed to stop. Yeah, you got to remember too, like at that time, there were no vaccines. I was in Europe, so a lot of it was kind of, you know, foreign in the sense. And we just didn't know what was going on, man. So, I went from playing really well, like having this momentum from the Israel job all the way years later to the Sweden job. And I'm really balling, guys. I'm talking about like my game has grown like so much. And then I get to this point where it's taken away from me, where things are out of my control. So when they were in my control, they got taken away from me. And I learned that lesson. Now that I learned that and I'm producing at a high level, it's taken away from me outside of my control. And that was another point of transition for myself because I had to realize that I was more than the game. But it was tough for me to do that because I felt like there was just some things that I was trying to accomplish that, again, by no circumstance of my own, it just, things had to stop. So I got home just like everyone else, was scared to touch a grocery cart, everybody was living at home. We are wearing masks everywhere, gloves, like not knowing, will I be able to fly back to Europe and continue this career that I set my heart on, that I have really, dove into like wholeheartedly, not necessarily worrying about anything else, but trying to make sure that, I can achieve those things. Um, Time went by, salaries were different, the world was different. And overseas basketball started to feel like a distant cousin that I was never going to see again. Unfortunate, still sad to this day. I feel like a lot of unresolved feelings, but I think at that moment in time, I had to make a decision. I'm at home, I'm living with my parents, I'm waiting on this next contract or call to work out. I wouldn't necessarily come home and get a place because I'm just going to leave again. and sitting there with no money, right? Like really just doing odd jobs, working kids out, doing different things to try and make ends meet while I waited for my next contract that never came. And so, I got to the point where I said, you know what? I'm going to stop. I'm going to transition. I'm going to try to figure out this next step, whatever that is. And that was the moment where I realized I hadn't prepared the way that I wanted to, or I hadn't prepared the way that I needed to. And at any moment, right, pandemic aside, it could have been anything. It could have been injuries. It could have been team circumstances. It could have been a lot of different factors that wouldn't have allowed me to go back out there and play. But I was so locked in after that experience in Israel and finally experiencing some success that I didn't necessarily do the things necessary I feel like I should have to make it an easy transition. Granted, it was a pandemic. It wasn't a lot of jobs. It wasn't a lot of things going on, but still, just the frame and the mind to know, hey, this is exactly what I want to do. Um, Granted, I did do my master's online. Thanks from some motivation from my now wife, that was my fiance, to go and get my master's online, but still just unsure because I didn't think I would have to do this early. Um, when your back's against the wall and you really have to figure out who you are and look yourself in the mirror, there's a lot of things that shift in you. And, I started to just apply to different jobs and I realized that I need some help in this thing. Started to reach out to just old friends to see, what they're doing now, to learn more about the industries that they're in. And it really was just a listening tour. It was learning. It was making connections. It was all those things because I just knew that I didn't want to come back and be a regular guy. I didn't want to come back and just, be a trainer. I didn't want to come back and just be a coach or any of those things. I wanted to keep the same feeling that I felt as a professional basketball player, as important as I felt and all those things. I wanted to keep that certain level without having a plan. And so some jobs that I did come across wasn't good enough for me. Some opportunities that, would have been good for me, I just didn't have the resources or even the know-how to like dive into those. So, I ended up finding something through a connection and that got me my start. And a lot of times in this transition game, like all you really do need is just a start, or all you really do need is somebody to take a chance on you. And so I was able to find that person that was going to take a chance on me. And from that standpoint, was able to just learn, fail, 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 and do everything that I could to get to where I needed to be. And I realized through those trials and error the things that I wanted to do. I realized that, you know, entrepreneurship, business building, things like that was always a passion of mine. Like I said, I grew up in a family of entrepreneurs where my father kind of taught us the principles of buying and selling. When, like I said, he's a pastor, and so I used to sell candy at the church after church every Sunday, 25 cents for a Mike and Ike. One day I sold nachos in there. I was selling a lot of different things and bartering and doing different things like that, just based off what I saw my parents do. I was in middle school selling Smarties in the bathroom, going to Sam's Club, getting Airheads, selling candy at school. And so I knew that entrepreneurship was actually something that, I always innately had or was interested in. But it really dawned on me when I got into the work field and somebody gave me a chance to work at an entrepreneurship center that that was my passion. And so, was able to transition there and to learn as much as I could. And that took me from working 2 years in that entrepreneurship center, from starting as just like a lonely like assistant to then being the director by the end of my tenure. From that I learned that in any parts of transition, whether it's a pandemic that reshifts your course, whether it's you getting fired that reshifts your course, whether it's you, just having a want for something new. Um, Sometimes rejection is protection, and nobody talks about that enough. Nobody talks about how some of the things that you may lose will allow you to grow into who you need to be. And all while it was still early for me, I think that the timing that I left the game really allowed me to turn into who I am now. I don't know. I can't say, I'm not a fortune teller to say if I kept playing for a couple more years, I wouldn't have this same thing. But I can say that the time that I did leave, the way the opportunity shaped up, the way the pandemic allowed people to work from home and allowed me to learn more from the from the house rather than being on the job. There was a lot of things that went into it that I think it was God's perfect timing for me to step into my next. And so after I began working at the Entrepreneurship Center in Richmond, like I said, started to advance and do pretty well there. Realized as an athlete that I had a lot of skills and a lot of presence in a room that some folks just didn't have. And that a lot of these skills and jobs are just learnable. Like if you really sit down and talk to someone and learn, it's not something that's insurmountable. And so was able to advance and move up in my career and move to DC. Moved to DC, started working in venture capital and entrepreneurship, ran small business programs for large companies like Goldman Sachs, the NFL, Ford, philanthropy. I mean, the list goes on of the companies I was exposed to. And that job and that transition just came by happen chance. I saw a post on LinkedIn. I reached out, didn't even apply, and got an interview. A lot of this stuff just came from reaching out from to connections, just like the first job did, just reaching out to people and trying to learn. I myself knew nothing about venture capital, like literally nothing. And for the first couple of months I was at that job, it showed. Um, but, it was all about just belief in myself and trial and error. And because I've been exposed to transitions before, nothing was harder than getting fired in Israel. Nothing was harder than, retiring and transitioning from the sport. And so any new challenge that I will and have taken on, I felt like I'm equipped to do it, or I'm equipped to learn it. And so I got into that role, um, did pretty well with that transition into a new industry. Had to reach out to former athletes that actually work in that industry. They were able to share a lot of knowledge and worked in that field for about 2 to 3 years and transitioning into to when that opportunity dried up and there was restructure and, literally about a year ago was laid off of that opportunity, not of any fault of my own, but just sometimes there's restructure, sometimes there's ways to scale up without as many people. And I found myself, going from, again, rock bottom, losing my job in Israel to then skyrocketing, playing 3 more years in all these cool countries, to then the pandemic knocking me back down and it making me retire, you know, to then finding a job and excelling well in it, getting to DC, getting more money, getting into a new industry. And again, now, like laid off, going from making a boatload of money to unemployment. I mean, nobody really talks about the highs and lows of transition and how things can truly shape up in your life. But, I was a witness and a participant in a lot of roller coaster themed transition, man. And I tell you what, it's something that you think that, you leave this game and you transition and you're good, you got your career, but as you try to grow and as you try to excel, just like anything in the sports world, like when you're in practice and you're trying to push yourself, I mean, you got to ride the wave, man. And what you find though, each time you ride that wave, you built up muscle to be able to handle the next transition. And if you're in a position where you're not transitioning and you're not moving forward or moving, laterally or vertically or whatever it is, then you should probably just check your surrounding to make sure you're not getting complacent. And like I said, this was no choice of my own. If I had my choice, I would have kept working there. The money was great. The work was great. But God closed that door because he felt that, I needed to take another step. And at each time in my life that I felt comfortable, God's like, take another step. And I definitely don't understand why, but I know that when you're in it, you're in it. But I will say, like, this one took me for a loop. It took me for a loop. This was the hardest transition that I've ever had to make, even harder than letting the game go, because at this point in time, I'm married. I had my first beautiful kid and got a new house, and the job, like I said, the job was great, money was great, everything was great. Like I didn't even think about basketball anymore because at this point I'm rolling. And then lose that job literally a couple days for my birthday, a couple days before Thanksgiving, a month after my kid was born, and about a couple months after I closed on my house. And I tell you what, like that transition in itself was the hardest thing that I've ever had to face. This time, not just as a ball player, but this time as a man with a family, a man that um, can't afford to take losses like that, right? Like you can do that when you're younger. I could have done that when I played ball and I wasn't married and I was coming home and I crashed with my parents. You can take a loss contract. You can take, a bad outing, but in these circumstances and this type of transition, there's no room for failure the way you think it is, right? And so you feel as a man that there's just no room for failure. And I went through about 9 months of just like searching for who I was, searching for work, searching for connections, trying to stay motivated in a world where I felt like this transition was, eating me alive, man. I was able to get some contracts, continue to pay my bills, to continue to try and learn in a new industry. But whenever you're working on a contract and you need health insurance and your daughter's staring at you and your wife who's been very supportive is holding it down and you're trying to figure out ways to get back to that stable point. It tests every part of you. Um, I have my good days, I have my bad days. Again, I'm riding the wave, but for some reason this wave was about 9 months. Um, the things that I did to try and get through that transition were the same things that I did back then, but I just had to do it with a little more tenacity. And that's reaching out to people, that's learning about new industries, new things, that's going out of my way to have a conversation with somebody I don't know. Everything that got me the first opportunity that I have, I started to do that at this point. And what I learned is that, through while this situation felt as worse as it can be, it was the foundational pieces that I learned in my transition that aided me even in this deeper step. And that's something that we do at Athlete to Boardroom when we're working with athletes. We really drill home the fundamentals, just like if you were, uh, your player and you're working on these drills. I know they got all these fancy drills now, but just learning how to make a layup like can really help you. And so, leaning into those skills that helped me get that first opportunity was the same skills that I leaned into when I was going through the worst period of my life. And, you know, stay the course. Repetition is the best thing. Being able to understand that things don't always go the way they're supposed to go, and I should know that better than anybody, just given the experiences I've had, the games that I've been in, the teams, the situations. It's always up and down, but again, it's just like, how do you push through those moments? And, I'm proud to say now that I've transitioned again. I've started a new role in banking. I'm going to be still working with startup businesses and entrepreneurship. And that came, this fall. But, you know, I got let go last fall. So you can imagine the mental toll that that took on me. And even when I got this job offer, I struggled to be happy for myself. But what I realized is that, I mean, man, like anytime you win a transition game, anytime you're able to score in transition, all right, it's a win. It's a win. And what we need to learn about ourselves as athletes is that sometimes it's going to be small deposits. Things aren't always going to go our way. Things aren't always going to go your way when you come to Athlete to Boardroom and you're working the transition and we're driving home the common themes that you need to have to be successful and we're working out your plan. There's a bunch of things that can go left and go right, but how do you lean back into your fundamentals? How do you stay the course? And how do you know and you realize that that's the qualities that you've had all along? I realized that those are qualities that I've had all along and was able to get through those situations. And I'm here today to talk about it, right? And so, I said a lot to say. I walked you guys down my journey. I walked you down from, how I got to where I am now and the transition points that I've been in. But again, my mission in life now is to help athletes get through these periods, get through these tough periods because they keep happening. This isn't going to be a one-time relationship. This is something where, us as athletes need to come together to empower one another. And if I can do anything by providing a platform to do that, I will. And I will make sure that we as athletes have the tools to be successful. We as athletes are exposed to the different industries, even while we're playing. This podcast is meant to help folks understand that they can be an accountant, that they can be an appraiser, that they can get into tech, that they can go to Harvard. I mean, we're going to have people on this show this season that are going to talk about the amazing things that they've done and the transition points in their lives. And so I know that Rodney's story may be different from others, but there's a lot of them that are similar. There's a lot of athletes that have to give up the game for circumstances outside of their control. Mine was the pandemic. Yours might be maybe a family member sick. Yours might be this or that. And so we all have a common theme that, transition is coming for us at one point. And we also know that this thing, comes in ebbs and flows. But athletes are built tough. Athletes are built with discipline. And that's the innate qualities that can really help you, get to that next level. And so stay tuned with me this season. Stay tuned to Athlete to Boardroom. If you know an athlete that is struggling with transition that can use help, have them reach out to us. If you are an athlete right now looking at this or listening to this message and you liked, what you heard about my story and you can resonate, let's chop it up. I think this is the first of many. This is a way to welcome things back and to kick things off. But I'm Rodney Williams, man. I'm the founder of Athlete to Boardroom. You're now tuned into the Transition Game podcast, sponsored by the Athlete to Boardroom. And if you feel this message about getting the word out to athletes, like, share, subscribe to this channel, and let's get things moving. Let's have a great season, man.